Well, folks, it's time for another Marvel Snap card review. All of the cards releasing in April 2023 were officially revealed earlier today, so we've got final confirmation on all of these stats and abilities, and perhaps more importantly, we've gotten some developer updates on the specifics of how these cards work. There are some intricacies here, especially for SNOWGUARD, and we've got a lot of additional details to talk about. So I'm going to be covering all four of these cards in this video for, I think, their playability, the decks you might see them in, and rating them all from 1 to 4 stars. But we're going to kick it off here with Hitmonkey, the Season Pass card for April, and boy, do I think this one is going to be really good. So Hitmonkey is a 2/0 with the on-reveal gain +2 power for each other card you played this turn. And boy, I think that's going to scale up like crazy. I think this will very easily be a 2/6, a 2/8, maybe even higher for the cards that run it, which of course is an incredibly efficient stat output. So there are a few different things I think are going to enable this card really nicely. Of course, you want to play a bunch of cheap cards in the same turn, and there are a few ways to do that. Number one, you have bounce decks that just play a bunch of 1-cost cards and then particularly bounce them back with Beast. Keep in mind, you can also bounce Hitmonkey back to get multiple on reveals. So you could say have like a turn 4 where you played a couple 1-cost cards and you played a Hitmonkey to make it a 2/4. You could bounce all of that back and then have a turn 6 where you maybe play 4 or 5 other cards with this, giving an additional +10 or something, making it basically like a 2/14 on the final turn in a bounce stack. We've also got Kitty Pryde that could fuel into that, which currently is disabled. They took her out of the game because she was causing crashes, but as soon as she comes back, that just adds extra power potential to these bounce stacks, where I think that's going to be an absolutely crazy combination potentially. And you don't even need Beast necessarily to make it good. Just playing a big bunch of 1-drops on 6 alongside Hitmonkey is going to feel really nice. So you could also do that in something like a Zoo deck. We've seen some of these turn 6 Zoo decks where they set up Angelas and Bishops early and then try to play for this big turn 6 dump. Saving 4 1-cost cards in hand to play alongside your Hitmonkey is absolutely not a crazy idea for those sort of decks, creating absolutely monster power spikes while also fueling those Angelas and Bishops and everything else that plays really nicely into those game plans. And then finally, you've also got Sarah decks. Sarah will be able to discount Hitmonkey to 1 alongside other discounts. So for Sarah decks that are able to dump a bunch of cards on the final turn, drop a Sentinel and a Hitmonkey and still weave in a Shang-Chi if you want, right? And you're going to be able to, again, dump absolutely crazy amounts of power. So I can see already 3 distinct archetypes that I think support this card really well, that are already proven archetypes. Some, especially with like Sarah decks, are really good archetypes. So I think he's going to slot really naturally into that. There are also just a few like card pairings that are nuts with this. Things like Mysterio is absolutely crazy with Hitmonkey because it procs him alone 3 times. So, you know, we talked about that 2/14 Hitmonkey. Well, what if one of the extra cards you played is a Mysterio and now it's suddenly a 2/18 Hitmonkey in that game plan? Because Mysterio alone makes this just a 2/6. So that's, you know, 2 cards for 10 power right there. And of course, you're going to do even more beyond that for Hitmonkey. So pretty crazy card. I think the decks too that are trying to play into this, I don't think they're gonna have that hard of a time activating it. So I don't think like the fail state on this card is all that bad. Like sometimes, oh man, I only got 2 cards played alongside my Hitmonkey. Well, that's still a 2/4. That's not an absolute disaster. It's not great, of course, but you're okay with that scenario. So I think as long as the deck is built in a reasonably sensible way, the floor for Hitmonkey is probably a great, efficient stat play, and the ceiling for this card is absolutely bonkers high. So to me, this card just looks great. I think so many decks are going to be able to use this well. Probably going to feel oppressively good in some cases. I think this card is just really, really strong. So next up here we have Jeff, and I think he's Jeff the baby land shark, if I recall the name correctly. And I apparently don't know enough about Marvel lore because I know nothing about this dude. Is he like from a cartoon? Is he from comics? Does he hang out with like the Avengers? Is he like sitting next to Iron Man? Are they in the same universe? Because he looks so goofy and cartoony. I don't know. The card's pretty cool, whatever the case. He's a 2/3, and he reads, you can move this once, and nothing can stop you from moving or playing this to any location. So basically the goal here with Jeff is having a card that can just go anywhere and do anything and give you the ability to contest any given location. So Sanctum Sanctorum, you can't play cards here. Yeah, Jeff doesn't care. You can still play cards here, of course. And we've gotten a few, very clear examples from developers as well, already confirming today people's questions. Things like Professor X, doesn't matter. You can still play Jeff in a Professor X location, and stuff like Space Throne. If you have a card already in Space Throne, you can only have one card here. Again, Jeff doesn't care. That's the implication in the card text. No real surprises there for me, but just good to see these examples coming through and showcasing that he really does kind of have impunity when it comes to contesting locations. And yeah, I think that could be a useful tool for some decks to have. We've already seen cards like Nightcrawler pop into a handful of different decks. He's kind of lost favor over the last 6 months or so, but especially early on in Marvel Snap's lifespan, Nightcrawler was everywhere because it was just so great to be able to move a card into a location that you otherwise couldn't get to, couldn't contest, was destroying your cards, whatever it might be. But Jeff has even an extra layer of that sort of utility, because even if a location's completely shut down, you can't move into it, Professor X, etc., you've still got Jeff as an option to get you additional cards there. And although, a 2/3 is not exciting in its own right, having that degree of flexibility might be really nice. I think additionally, if there's ways for decks to utilize some extra synergy on this, for instance, maybe a move deck really cares about having Jeff because that gives them extra stuff to do and proc move sort of effects. So that would be another reason to run Jeff. Some decks I think will say, yeah, I don't really need Jeff. I'm just going to play cards that are more directed towards my game plan. So I don't think like every deck is going to use a Jeff or need a Jeff. Shuri decks aren't going to need Jeff because they just get big enough. They win the game normally in most circumstances. Having this kind of hedge card to play for safety isn't going to be as valuable. But something like a Sarah deck that has a few different tech cards and answers and pieces in there to help solve different kinds of problems, I could see Jeff showing up in deck lists like that for sure. So, kind of a mix and match. I'm sure it's a card too people will find as like a pet card. They just love putting Jeff in decks because it gives them the chance to contest every given sort of situation or scenario. Even if he doesn't really bear out in the data as a super powerful card, I still think this is one we'll see pretty often. And I think he'll feel pretty good in a lot of cases too. So in other words, great. All right, so next up here, we've got SNOWGUARD, and this is a really cool card and a surprisingly complex card as well. We're going to have a lot to break down. We've gotten multiple developer insights now today on Twitter and Discord, etc., on how this card works. I'm going to share a lot of details on this one. But SNOWGUARD is a 1/2 that reads, while in your hand, this transforms each turn into a hawk or a bear. And as you can see, the hawk version is on reveal, ignore all location abilities next turn. The bear version is on reveal, trigger the effect of this location. Now, before we get to those, there is already some detail on how this works. So SNOWGUARD will transform when it enters your hand. So for instance, if you're on like turn 4 and you top deck the SNOWGUARD, you don't have to sit on the base version for a turn. It will immediately transform. And on top of that, it's always going to transform into the Hawk version first. It is not a random transformation. Hawk will come first. If you decide not to play it that turn, then it will transform into the bear, and so on throughout the remaining turns. So the only way to get a base SNOWGUARD in your hand, I think, is through something like a Maria Hill. If she generates a SNOWGUARD, apparently that one will remain the base version until the end of turn. It will not immediately transform into one of the animal versions. Okay, so now let's talk about the Hawk and how this works. This one's on reveal, ignore all location abilities next turn. So first off, that's for both players. I think an initial reading for this one, I thought, oh, ignore. That sort of implies they're going to happen, but they won't happen for me. They will happen for the opponents. Incorrect. We've got confirmation that it's a symmetrical ignoring. It's kind of like disabling the abilities for the next turn. So if you have some, like, oh no, they're gonna be playing Shuri on Kamar-Taj, and I don't want that to happen, you could say play SNOWGUARD on turn 3 and disable Kamar-Taj on turn 4 so that your opponent cannot benefit from Shuri. Alternatively, if there's some really annoying thing, oh man, that Bifrost is going to screw me, I don't want that Bifrost to go off for whatever reason, then you could use SNOWGUARD on turn 3 and disable the Bifrost on turn 4 so that it won't actually activate. Also importantly, the post turn 6, locations will still be active because that is not a turn. This again has been confirmed. So for instance, if there's an Onslaught Citadel and you're worried like, oh man, that Onslaught Citadel is making their Patriot insane, what if I play SNOWGUARD on turn 5 and then I turn off Onslaught Citadel for turn 6 so that it's not there at the end of the game? It won't work. It'll turn it off for turn 6, but once turn 6 ends and the end of game state begins, Onslaught Citadel turns back on for the final power calculations. So you can't shut off like some stuff like that. Ongoing stuff won't work quite as well. Of course, you can still shut off Kamar-Taj on turn 6, etc. But some considerations there for like end of game state. All right, so moving on to the bear version, this will trigger the effect of this location on reveal. So keep in mind, number one, this will not make an impact for turn-based locations. If they have a turn-based condition, for instance, we mentioned Bifrost earlier. On turn 4, move all cards to the right. If you play this on turn 5 on Bifrost, it's not going to move all cards to the right because it didn't meet the condition of on turn 4. So you need a more generically worded location with just a kind of one-time thing that can be triggered. Here I just pulled up a quick example. Central Park will work with the bear. That is a one-time trigger. If you play SNOWGUARD on Central Park, you're going to add another layer of squirrels to each location. So there could be some scenarios, of course, where that is a particularly beneficial play for you. If you want to lock out your opponent's board, could also be a downside. So you're going to be looking for locations that have this sort of effect. They're not conditional. They're not like on play sort of things. They're triggerable instances, if that makes sense. So what does all of this mean for the playability of SNOWGUARD? Well, I think I have some concerns there, actually, because this card has this kind of natural inconsistency built into it because you're alternating between these two effects. I think the Hawk version of the effect will be more valuable in most cases, kind of trying to deny your opponent opportunities or create some opportunities for yourself. Particularly, some decks can be especially susceptible to bad location RNG, and they need locations to be more easy to work with, and the Hawk version could really enable that, shutting down some negative effect for a turn, give you room and space to play into there and such. I think that would be really useful. If you always had the Hawk version in hand, I suspect this card would actually be a really powerful card and a really high utility card. But the fact that it's alternating to the bear version, I think it's going to be a lot harder to find instances where you're happy to use the bear. Or perhaps the better way to say that is you're just going to be sitting on the bear waiting for the moment to use the Hawk instead in most cases. Like, yeah, of course, there will be scenarios where the bear creates a big play here and there, but I think as I look through a lot of the locations, so many don't really have an activatable effect. There's so many like conditions and things that make the bear probably harder to find real value on average. So if you're just kind of sitting there waiting, then you have to line the Hawk up on time and make sure it fits into your curve. And it's like, okay, I want to do this big thing on turn 5. That means I need to play the the Hawk version of SNOWGUARD on turn 4. And then like, oh, that messes up. Then I can't play this card. So you've got all of these kind of checks going into this to get this effect to go off. You got to line up so many different things. I have a feeling very often it's going to feel like it's just too awkward or it's not doing what you needed to do when you needed to do it. You can't build a reliable curve or game plan or have a lot of predictability. Some decks have more flexibility. Certainly decks can pivot and adjust their curve a little bit. That might be a space for SNOWGUARD in some of those scenarios. But decks that have a really well-defined game plan or curve or want to set up really specific scenarios, it might be a little bit harder for SNOWGUARD to make an impact, especially if drawn late in a game and you can't really plan around it. I think that's a real downside for it as well. So I don't know, the inflexibility of this card in some ways, like it's actually extra flexible because you can do multiple things with it. But I think that creates inflexibility in a weird way. I think that might be something that holds this one back. So really fun looking card. I also just absolutely adore this aesthetic. These animals look so freaking cool. But I don't know if it's going to be something that slots into all too many decks. I have a feeling they're going to find it more punishing or more awkward than helpful. All right, so finally here we have Stegron, a new 4/5 with on reveal, move an enemy card from here to another location. And it has been confirmed that's random, even though it doesn't say random. We don't have ways to target or manipulate our opponent's cards, so we default to a random assumption, I think, unless otherwise very clearly called out. And indeed, both the card moved and the location in this case will be random. So that means there's a couple different ways here really to use Stegron. Number one is on a card your opponent has already played. Say they dropped, a big doubled Red Skull in the left location, and you're like, man, they think they've got the left location locked up. Well, too bad. I'm going to play Stegron there and surprise them and move Red Skull out of the way. So perhaps I win that location really easily because they thought it was completely safe, but Stegron has disrupted that. So kind of like a juggernaut for after the card has been played. But you can also use Stegron like a juggernaut. It has been confirmed this can work on face down cards. So if you're going into turn 6 and you want to make sure that they can't beat you at the right location in particular, then what you can do is play a Stegron there. Even if they only have that face down card and you revealed first, he will still work on face down cards. So he'll slap unrevealed cards out of the way and safely secure that location. Of course, at a little bit higher expense than something like Juggernaut. Now, there are some complications there because if your opponent has other smaller cards that are already in play, they've got a couple, 2-power units next to the big thing that you want to move, he might miss. He might hit the 2-powered stuff and really not make much of a difference in that case. So there is some real risk there. Unlike a Juggernaut where it's going to hit specifically the card played right now, and both of them, Stegron's a little iffy in some scenarios if you try to use him in that way. So I think he's going to be better for a card that's already in place. But even then, for that like Red Skull example, if that's next to an armor, are you going to move the armor or are you going to move the Red Skull? Maybe it doesn't matter if you got a Shang-Chi lined up, but maybe it does matter a little bit depending on how you're trying to disrupt your opponent. So I think there are going to be a lot of scenarios where Stegron actually does feel a little bit awkward. Like, well, he didn't really do much. He moved the Red Skull out of here, but now it's just somewhere else that I have to deal with. You might be able to build decks in scenarios where that's okay. Like, oh, I've got a Professor X here. I just want to make sure Red Skull's not here. Let's move everything to this other location and then just kind of stack up all the opponent's threats in one dead location for me, and then Stegron will help me secure this other spot. Those possibilities exist, but then again, you've got that inconsistency with smaller stuff next to the card. If he specifically targeted the most powerful enemy card at a location, or you had some little bit more extra layer of control on the Stegron, I think that would really help. But as it stands, being fully random on which cards he's going to hit, I think there's a lot of scenarios where it's going to whiff. So I do think that limits Stegron's utility for a lot of decks where they just can't afford to run this 4-power card that has this kind of shaky reliability on its outcomes. Things like Juggernaut are a little bit predictable. Cards like Arrow, of course, were way more universal in their ability to win games, particularly because that could isolate all of your opponent's threats in one spot, whereas Stegron, you've kind of got this 50-50 about where the threats are actually going. It's only protecting one spot instead of protecting 2 spots. So far less utility than some of the other mover disruptor sort of cards that exist out there. So, since this doesn't have a crazy high power total associated with it, if you think about things like Polaris or Magneto, those have movement effects that can both be useful, but also are overpowered a little bit for their cost. Stegron's the same power as a card like Polaris. Clearly, his effect is better when it goes well, but sometimes a lot worse when it doesn't go well. So there's all these different levers that are balancing this card out. But for me, it kind of comes in on the weak side compared to a lot of its peers. Now, I think it could still get played in like Zabu Sarah decks where you're already running a bunch of 4-cost cards, and this one just kind of feels like it fits in, it slots into that deck rather nicely as another way to perhaps put power where you want or manipulate your opponents a little bit. But I think the decks that are actually going to make room for Stegron are probably rather slim in nature, because I think you need a way to really make him cheaper or perhaps super synergize with this movement effect, something like Kingpin or something, right? Some real like location manipulation and move destruction synergies perhaps to make this guy feel a little bit more reliable on those outcomes. So I actually do really have some doubts here in regards to Stegron's strength. Hitmonkey is a 4-star card. Jeff is a 3-star card. SNOWGUARD is a 2-star card. Stegron is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Sorry I had to run through so many details on all the different interactions with these cards, but a lot of stuff came up today on Twitter. So hopefully we learned a little bit about how these cards are expected to work, and hopefully you know, you got some heads up on what's going to be powerful here. Now, as always, I'll say, by God, do not purchase cards in the token shop based on the random ramblings of some idiot YouTuber like me. My God, don't buy a card because I said it's good or bad. Of course, wait for data out there. Probably don't spend 6,000 tokens on any of these anyway. I think it's pretty likely Hitmonkey is a good season pass purchase, but if you want to make sure your $10 or whatever is well spent, you should still wait to see a little data rolling in and see this sort of card in action. But I do think he's going to be pretty powerful. So all that said, share your thoughts on these cards down in the comments below. Thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.